Hello and welcome to the Saturday streaming edition of Adam's Music Box. And today I want to talk about something that's sort of always around us when we're thinking about recorded music, but I don't know if I've ever delved into it. And that is the non musical art that typically accompanies a musical recording. I'm talking, of course, about the imagery, the album artwork. And it's something that at least for people who grew up in the 20th century, it was so ubiquitous that I would say that psychologically and neurologically, if someone were to say, okay, think of a certain album, you probably think of the image of the album cover and maybe a snippet of music from the actual album itself simultaneously. So let's just try it together. Think Dark Side of the Moon. Well, you're probably imagining in your head the prism. Think Sergeant Pepper's, you're seeing the cover. Think Herb Alpert's Whipped Cream and Other Delights. It's the girl in the whipped cream dress. Just to name three. And don't worry, I'm not going to rank the best album artwork because frankly, there's just too much to rank, and many other people have tried, but there's always a lot of good stuff that's let out because album artwork, as the name might imply, was truly an art, a rarefied and very specific art form that was, yes, it was commerce. It was art in the name of commerce, but I think a lot of it could also be described as art for the sake of art. It was art that stood on its own, or alternatively, something that was so implicit to the music that they were complementary to the point of being mutually inclusive. So, where do we begin the story? Well, in the early days of recorded sound, the sound utensils, the actual media on which the sound was delivered, were not housed in any sort of elaborate covers or jackets or anything else. Take, for instance, the 78 record, the most ubiquitous means of music media delivery prior to the middle of the 20th century. Now, 78s were generally sold as singles. They could also be sold as albums, insofar as that's where we get the name album. A 78 itself could hold the approximate length of about one song or a movement, a short movement or part of a movement of a symphony, of a symphony. And as a result, if you wanted to have, let's say, a full symphony, whether it's Schubert's Ninth or Beethoven's Fifth or whatever, you needed to do something called have an album. Now, what does having an album mean? It means having a series of 78 records that are numbered. Disc 1, Disc 2, you get the idea. And of course, they're double-sided. And how were these discs sold? They were sold in a book-like device that very much resembled a photo album. And much like you would slide a printed photograph in and out of the photo album, you would slide the 78 disc in and out of this album. So that's where we get the name album, a name that appears on Spotify and a name that appeared in many other places, but it only literally applied to the 78 record because they were sold in these photo style albums. So both when a 78 was sold as a single, which was the most common way it was sold, and when it was sold in an album, the cover art was non-existent. The singles themselves were usually shipped in a very heavy sort of brown cardboard-like paper that would have either nothing on it because the center of the 78 would be sticking out, so you could see the title, the artist, the copyright, etc. But it would increasingly as time goes on just have a description on the actual sort of cardboardy thingy paper cardboardy thingy of what the music was that you could listen to. It would often, increasingly as time went on from the 1920s, have the logo of the record company, but that was pretty much it. It was a very austere experience. And the same was true of albums. The album would usually just have on the cover, it would be a nice cover in many cases, a kind of faux leather bound something or another. I sound like I'm on the Home Shopping Channel, but it would have that sort of thing. And it would have, the name of the artist and the pieces of music. So, Bing Crosby goes south of the border. Wilhelm Mengelberg and the Concertgebouw Orchestra play Beethoven's Fourth Symphony, etc. You get the idea. And again, though, these were all very austere. Then, however, in 1938, Columbia Records, one of the major record labels, decided it was time to spice things up a bit. And so they hired an artistic consultant called Alex Steinwise, and he invented the concept and the reality of the modern album cover art feature. Ooh, ah. And just to remind you, this was not used on the singles. They continue to be sold in the nondescript bags, not unlike a homeless man having a 40 on the side of the road as Gavin Newsom drives by in his BMW. But on albums, you would increasingly see artwork developed by Alex Steinwise and eventually by hundreds, if not thousands of people, not thousands at this early stage, but lots of people got into it eventually. And so you'd have a artwork, you'd have a drawing of Bing Crosby on his album, you'd have, a Toscanini photograph, because he was obviously very popular in the age of 78, and just barely into the age of the LP. Now, the age of the LP, why is that important? Well, the idea of album artwork, it caught on in the late 30s and into the 40s, but a lot of 78 albums were still sold in rather austere packages in the 1940s, and this was always true of 78 singles. But at the end of the 1940s, Columbia again came out with a new format for listening to music. It was the long playing record. And while some of the early ones were 10-inch, they eventually grew because of diet and exercise to 12 inches. And that has been the standard format of the LP ever since. Now, what does this have to do with the visual aspect of it? Because many times before I have on this channel discussed, hold on, water break. So unprofessional, I know. But hey, it's free, you can't complain. So I've talked many times on this channel about the sonic revolution that accompanied the advent, promotion, and eventual ubiquity of the 12-inch long playing record. But what about the visual aspect of it? Well, the album was dead. Long live the album. What do I mean? Well, one of the main advantages, apart from sound quality, of course, of the long playing record is that you could fit roughly 22-ish minutes on each side of the record. So the entire LP, both sides considered, could be anywhere between, let's say, 40 and 45 minutes of music, depending on how you cut the record. Now, why is that revolutionary? Well, it means that apart from very long symphonies, you can get the average symphony on a single disc, as opposed to the 10 or 12 discs that it would have taken for even a medium length symphony, let alone a long one. I mean, I'm exaggerating a bit, but those albums, those 78 albums, those were a lot of discs. And what that did is it really broke up the continuity of the music, because you would have to switch discs or flip one over, sometimes usually, frankly, in the midst of a movement, and of course, between movements. And so the idea of sitting back and relaxing wasn't really applicable when you were listening to a lengthy piece of music on a 78. Likewise, in terms of a set of songs, whether it was a Bing Crosby album or anyone else, after every song or every other song, depending on how they cut it, you have to flip the record, then change the record. And so the idea again of sitting back, relaxing, having a martini, having a cigarette, and just letting the music wash over you, it wasn't really happening with 78s. Happens with an LP. Because on a average single LP, you can get two movements of a symphony on either side. So yes, in between the second and the third movement, you're going to have to flip it, but comparing one flip of one disc to maybe 6 flips of 6 discs, or in some cases for a longer collection of music, 12, it was a revolution. And of course, each side being between 20 and 25 minutes, plenty of time for the martini and cigarette. So the culture of lounging out and listening to music was made possible by the LP. But let's get back to the art. I'm talking about more of the sociology, and on previous videos I talked about the sound quality, but let's get to the art. Well, things got bigger because a 12-inch record was housed in a larger record jacket than any other format before or synths. It was equaled by the Laserdisc, a audiovisual format, but no other format before or since in terms of music listening media, or media through which you listen to music, if we're going to be grammatically precise. None of it came in as big a package as the LP record. And what does that mean? It meant that the opportunity for larger art was now possible. And this ushered in the golden age of album artwork, or let's say the first of many golden ages of album artwork. And this was the 1950s. Now, there's a trend that we're going to see here, which is that whenever a new audio listening format comes out, and when it is noted for representing an improvement in the overall listening experience, the record labels will lead with a lot of classical recordings. Now, there's several reasons for this. One, with classical recordings, you generally don't need to pay for publishing rights, because when we're talking about 19th century music or before, and that's where most classical European music resides, you don't have to pay the estate of Beethoven or Mozart or Schubert when you perform their music the way you would of a living or recently deceased songwriter. So that allows the record companies to get a lot of music out there for less money than, in terms of their investment, than they would have had to have spent for another format of music. The other reason is that classical music lovers they tend to take audiophilia. They tend to take sound quality more seriously than others. Now, I don't think that's true anymore, and I don't even know if it's been true for a long time, but from the dawn of recorded sound to at least the late 70s or the 80s, the audiophile brigade was led by, an officer class that listened to classical music. And so if classical music buyers, well, they always represented a minority of the market. I mean, in the 50s, they maybe went as high as 7 to 8 to 9, maybe 10%. That's really pushing it. So a very small segment of the music buying market, pop music, obviously, as the name would imply, is the biggest. But why then did these labels cater for this small segment of the market? Because they were high spenders. They cared about audio quality. They would buy the same piece of music multiple times, because you would want to hear Beethoven's Ninth conducted by different artists. You would like to hear the differences in artistic interpretation between a Mengelberg conducting, or a Furtwängler, or a Weingartner, or a Klemperer, or a Abendroth, or you get the idea. And so in classical music, it's essential to have more than one recording of a single piece of music, because every interpretation is a unique artistic statement. So that's another reason. Another reason yet is that classical music purists really cared about having different and unique audiophile experiences, and they would compare the different recording techniques of the different labels. And so while it might have seemed like competition, and it certainly was between the various labels putting out their classical catalog, a lot of the labels knew that these audiophiles would be buying whichever version of Beethoven's Ninth comes out on RCA, the version of Beethoven's Ninth that comes out on Columbia, that comes out on Decca London, that comes out on Mercury, Everest, etc. And so, sorry, really humid, I need my water. Oh yeah, as Peggy Hill would say. And so, there was another reason, though, and I think, and again, this is where we get back to the visual art aspect of the whole thing. Album artwork was really cool in the 50s. It was really out there. It could be very sexy. It could be suggestive. It could be what people in the 21st century might call offensive, but it was really fucking cool. Now, guess which genre in the 50s had the most outrageous album artwork? You're probably wrong, because it was classical. The classical artwork of the 50s and the 60s tended to be much more elaborate and sensual and suggestive than any other genre, apart from maybe lounge music, where you'd have, sexy women at the Coconut Cabana type of thing. But apart from that, which is sort of a novelty genre, but of music that really stands on its own merits, the classical album covers were the most wild and outrageous. And I think that this, in addition to all of those other factors, played a huge part in the disproportional popularity of classical records in the 50s and 60s. Now, again, we're still talking about at the very most between 7 and 10% of the market. Some would say even less. But the people who bought it, like I said, they were vociferous. And I do think that of that group, a lot of them were probably encouraged to buy more than they would have bought because of the album artwork. And dare I say, I think some music buyers that may have not had a prior interest in classical music when it was sold in those austere 78 albums that just have the name of the artist on the cover in bound in leather, when they're now seeing, soldiers marching and, women with very little clothes and interesting buildings and seascapes and snowscapes and all the rest of it on the covers of these classical albums, people are saying, well, I don't know who Rimsky-Korsakov is. Rimsky-Korsakov. But that album cover looks great. And I've never heard of Eugene Ormandy. But this looks interesting, Columbia Records. And is it Charles Munich? Charles Munk on RCA Records. But that's a very moody picture. I'd like to display that when I have the girls over for the martini drinking contest. And so I do think that those very cool album covers really got people into it. I mean, RCA with their Living Stereo probably had some of the coolest albums, but Decca's US subsidiary, London Records, had amazing album art too with their wonderful bluebacks. Mercury Living Presence had some very cool ones. Everest Records, a smaller label, but one that was really popular among a lot of audiophiles. I mean, these were all audiophile aimed labels at the time, Everest, and then you had ones like Westminster, you had Vanguard, Command, all of them. All of these labels, without exception, had interesting album artwork. Now, other genres shouldn't feel left out. I think that a lot of the wonderful covers of the Blue Note jazz albums of the 50s and 60s are one of the reasons why, again, another genre that wasn't a big share of the record buying public, but those wonderful black and white images of the artists that appeared on Blue Note, and Impulse did similar things as well, another great label specializing in jazz. I think that that made these albums iconic. When you think of John Coltrane's Blue Train, you think of that wonderful image of him. When you think of Miles Davis' Kind of Blue, what do you think of? That wonderful profile image. And so while the classical had the most outrageous cover art and the jazz albums were probably the most moody and restrained, they were equally iconic, as were the pop records with, some of the pictures that you might see in an Italian restaurant of Frank Sinatra. Well, those are more than just random pictures. A lot of them are taken from his album artwork, whether on Capitol or later on after the early 60s on Reprise. Wonderful, wonderful images there. And of course, as rock and roll got started, we had the second golden age of the album cover. So traditionally with pop music, and rock was sort of a ugly bastard child of pop in the eyes of the establishment in the early 60s, the album cover would generally be some sort of photo of the musical performers. They might be just in a film studio, they might be in a forest, they might be at the beach, as in the Beach Boys, but they were generally pictures of the artists. As you get further and further into the 60s, you get more and more into abstract album art. You'll have something like Days of Future Past by the Moody Blues, which is a painting. And all of the subsequent great Moody Blues albums were painted images that had nothing to do with portraying the band. You'd have really interesting avant-garde photography, like The Piper at the Gates of Dawn by Pink Floyd with that wonderful kaleidoscope effect. You'd have things like In the Court of the Crimson King, the painting of the Screaming Man. You'd have everything else Pink Floyd did, from The Prism to The Burning Man, Shaking Hands, who the stuntman who portrayed that image just died. May he rest in peace. One of the great ever album covers. Wish You Were Here. Of course, Pink Floyd with their pig for animals. I'm harping on Pink Floyd, but they did have some of the best album covers. But all of these interesting rock covers, Led Zeppelin 4 with The Old Man, Chicago, who had an iconic logo but no images of the band, yes, with their wonderful Roger Dean artistry, his wonderful paintings, and other bands, of course, used him too. Uriah Heep, many others. The point is, in this second golden age of album art that was dominated by rock, you would see a move away from, the straight photography of the traditional pop or classic pop of the 50s and 60s, which tended to just capture an image of the artist looking cool, but it was still a traditional photograph. By the time we're in the 70s, whether it's avant-garde jazz, jazz fusion. I mean, think of the Herbie Hancock's Headhunters album. Even with jazz now, you're getting into albums that don't have anything to do with straight photography. And so whether you're talking about singer-songwriters, whether it's prog rock, heavy rock, hard rock, jazz fusion, avant-garde jazz, world music, which was kind of becoming a thing. The name didn't exist yet, but it was becoming a thing. On every genre except for maybe country and western, which remained generally more conservative in its presentation, you were getting away from traditional photos of the band. And some of these album covers, like I said, in this age are iconic. Very different than the groovy and out there classical covers of the 50s and early 60s, but equally, if not more in many people's minds, iconic. And they even became a place where people could prepare narcotics, whether rolling a marijuana cigarette or, chopping up a few lines of dialogue. And so that only probably helped to ubiquitize these album covers and make them an indelible part of the music listening experience. So what have we covered so far? We covered the 20s and the 30s when you had austere, nothing album covers. And of course, 78 singles sold in even more austere, papery, cardboardy bags. 1938 come the first album cover for 78 albums, but things didn't really take off until the late 40s when the long playing record gave people a much bigger space to work with. And it was also at this time that some singles began being sold with nice artwork, though singles always were generally more austere in terms of the artwork. And of course, in this era, you had reel-to-reel tape, which came in a box only slightly bigger than a CD jewel case. You then had 8-track tapes, and later on the cassette, which had the smallest of all presentations, didn't lend itself to artwork well, but LP remained king overall, and it had all of the real estate for the artists and art lovers to work with. So now we are in the 1980s. So what happened in the age of the Blockbuster and of Ronald Reagan? Well, the CD came out, the compact disc. And what did this mean for artwork? Well, it meant things were once again smaller. Not only was the jewel case of the compact disc smaller than the LP, was smaller than the 78, smaller than the 78 album, smaller than the reel-to-reel tape, bigger than the cassette tape or the 8-track, I'll give you that, but it was still pretty small because they said, we are going to sacrifice this big art for ultra convenience. Because let's look at how the CD was marketed. Much like the LP when it came out, it was marketed as an audiophile format. And people to this day debate about LPs versus CDs. I think I've done videos on that. I've certainly discussed it in real life. It's a debate that will never end. Both formats were very defining in terms of their eras. But anyway, we're not having that argument now. But what was the CD sold as? Well, it was sold as something whose audio fidelity was superior to all other formats. That its convenience was superior for two reasons. One, it was smaller and took up less real estate on your shelf. That means you can buy more of them and not have to buy a bigger house, says the salesman. What was another point of convenience? Well, with an LP, it's got two sides. A CD has one side, and that one side contains more, or has the ability to contain more music than an entire LP. In fact, a CD is roughly, you can fit around 92 minutes on a single CD, or you can fit maybe 40 to 45 minutes on a single LP. So when all is said and done, you could fit almost more, or in some cases more than two entire records onto a CD. So that was the selling point Better quality, so they said. More convenient, so they said. Much more expensive too. But what did this mean for cover art? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. But something interesting about the CD. Remember when I said that classical music had a sort of golden age when the LP came out because classical music lovers wanted to hear their music in the highest fidelity possible. And when a new format came out, they would snatch up all of the multiple recordings of the same pieces, but by different artists across different record labels. Well, in the 80s, that happened, but in hyperdrive. In fact, in the first couple of years of the CD selling commercially, at one point, a majority of CD sales were classical music at one point. And that eventually went down to 20% rather rapidly, but that's still huge. Even in the 50s and 60s, classical, even though it was a very avid constituency, it was at most between 5 and 7, some would say between 7 and 10% of the LP buying public. But throughout the mid 80s, 20% of all CD sales were classical. Now, why did this occur? Several reasons. A new format that is billed as being audiophile nirvana compared to every previous format. Classical music listeners are very attracted by that. And there were other attributes of the compact disc that were very attractive to classical consumers as well. Traditionally, classical music has a lot more dynamic range than other types of music, meaning there's a greater difference between the loudest fortissimo passage and the quietest pianissimo passage. Now, what does that mean in terms of audiophile stuff? Well, the quieter the music is, the more you can hear the insufficiencies of an analog format. So when you have a very quiet passage in classical music, you can hear, the ticking and the static of an LP. I mean, some LPs are very quiet, especially some of the modern ones, but you get the idea. No LP is perfectly quiet. And so the surface noise that's present is much more apparent during a quiet passage than during a loud passage. That's thing number one. Tapes don't have that problem, but they do have tape hiss, and every generation of tape is going to have a level of hiss. Noise reduction in the analog world has divided classical people in its own right, but with the CD, you have no surface noise. You're not gaining a generation of tape hiss, and for a new digitally recorded piece of classical music, there's no tape hiss at all. So the fact that a CD could play things quiet without any additional noise being introduced from something mechanical or electromagnetic. This was a major selling point for classical music consumers. Another big selling point is that CDs could play at high volumes without having something which occurs on LPs, which is called inner groove distortion. As you get further and further into the center of the LP, the grooves necessarily have to get smaller because of something called geometry. And because of that, even when the record is cut very well, and even when you're playing it back on very good equipment, you can get distortion in loud passages. And what are the loudest passages of a piece of classical music? They're usually at the coda, at the finale. And so on a CD, that isn't the case, nor is it on the case with magnetic tape. But with a CD, you have an ultra convenient format that doesn't have the inner groove distortion, has less distortion overall than tape, although negligibly so, if you ask me, and that doesn't have any electromechanical types of noise, including surface noise. So all of these things were huge selling points in the classical community. And one of the early champions of the CD, who even helped with its invention in terms of he went back and forth with Sony about what the length should be. He said that it should be able to hold the entirety of my performance of Beethoven's Ninth on a single disc. And this man was one of the top selling classical artists of all time, the great Herbert von Karajan. And so for all of these reasons, classical was a huge factor in this. Some of the earliest CDs, in fact, the earliest were classical. I believe the first ever was Herbert von Karajan's old digital recording of Richard Strauss's Ein Alpine Symphony, the Alpine Symphony, wonderful piece of music. Now, what about the art? Well, classical music album covers of the 80s, when it was an album recorded in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or before, it would just be a smaller version of that album. But for the classical music recorded in the 80s, they took a very different view than the labels of the 50s and 60s did that were trying to make it fun. The classical music recorded in the 80s tended to have very bland artwork. Very, very, very bland. And that didn't apply to other forms of music. Now, interestingly, rock and soul and country and Western audiences were much slower in their adoption of the compact disc than classical, for some of the reasons I mentioned, and also because it was very expensive. And in general, classical, at least in the 20th century, classical music lovers were more willing to invest large amounts of money in filling up their music collection. But the cover art itself of classical music in the 80s got frankly really bad. And maybe that explains why, in spite of this boom at the beginning and middle of the decade, when all of these, pardon me, with all of these classical music lovers buying up the CD, by the end of the 80s and the turn of the 90s, the percentage of all music sales that was classical music had slipped to its lowest ever. It slipped to 3.8%. From as much as 20% of all sales, thanks to the CD. And at one point, almost all CD sales at the very beginning were classical. Now it was sliding back down. I wonder if that's because of the bland cover art on classical music, because classical music, in terms of having the ultra cool cover art that it had in the 50s and 60s, it never ever recovered. And it's an interesting question as to why, because of course all art was quite austere in the 20s, 30s, and much of the 40s. In the 50s, 60s, and 70s, but mainly the 50s and 60s, the classical art was the most cool and fun and outrageous of all, other than the lounge records. By the 80s, even though classical music by the middle of the decade was a huge selling point, because the audiophiles in the classical community, not all, some preferred analog still, but a lot of them at the time were really into the CD. Don't tell that to Sandy Chase. Some people know who that is. By the end of the decade, classical music was sinking, and it has continued and continued to sink. I think that in around 2015, there was some good news for the classical world. Not that classical was selling more, it wasn't, but jazz was becoming unpopular at an even more rapid rate than classical. Maybe that's because jazz cover art started to get pretty boring too, compared to the moody and mysterious blue notes of the 50s and 60s, or the really out there sort of moving and grooving and sexy sort of covers that were really part of almost all genres in the 1970s, in that golden age. Now, a lot of people have observed that in general, album artwork has become less prominent since the 90s because you lost the real estate. And I think that that's true in many cases. In hip hop, I think there's sort of a trend against that. And maybe that's because hip hop is one of the genres, along with audiophiles, who have kept the LP alive. Because in the 90s and early 2000s, the same audiophiles that decided that they loved the CD in the 80s now decided that maybe they didn't love it so much. And so you had a vinyl resurgence in the audiophile community, and obviously perpetually in the hip hop community, because vinyl is not just a music listening device in hip hop, but it's a music making device. The DJ with his two turntables is a musician in hip hop music. And I'm talking the 90s, early 2000s, long before the sort of 2010 sort of hipster thing, where you had all of these mid-grade, sort of sometimes sonically poor quality companies reissuing vinyl LP. For that reason, I'm talking about the audiophile stuff. So did the CD and the austere classical music covers of the 80s, in terms of the album art, did that eventually drive classical out of the marketplace? Were there broader sociological trends that did this? What about jazz? Could you explain the same for jazz? And now that we're in the age of most music being listened to without a physical format at all, where does artwork stand now? Theoretically, without the restriction of space, you could click on something and have an entire screen filled with artwork. You could have a 100-page PDF of liner notes, or you could have nothing. The sky is the limit, but then again, so is the basement. So that's where I think we can end today. I will say one other thing. I did say that classical music had generally been the favorite music of the audiophile community, and that was true. It began to change in the late 1970s because Mobile Fidelity and later other companies realized that there was an audiophile market for rock music and occasionally some jazz fusion as well. And so that's when you start to see the audiophile tent broaden. Before the late 70s, it was almost all classical with some jazz. By the late 70s, you get the rock and pop world having their own audiophile labels. And while MoFi did do jazz and classical, it really sold itself as being a rock audiophile label. And that was true with all of the audiophile labels of the late 70s and 80s, MoFi being the biggest. There was Nautilus, Directus, CBS Monster Sound had their own, and there were others. And then by the late 90s, with classic records and analog productions, it was all genres being catered to in the land of audio fidelity, except for a lot of soul, especially 70s and 80s soul and country and western. Since then, now we have a lot of soul titles coming out, still not a lot of country and western in the audiophile world, but that's just a little asterisk I needed to fill out. Right, that's our shoe for today. So remember, as always, to like, subscribe, and we will see you next time. Take care.